There is a popular aphorism that taxi drivers in Armenia's capital city of Yerevan repeat as mantra as they move about the streets and neighborhoods of the city and take in what has been happening since the 1990s, when the state socialism of the Soviet Union ended and Armenia became an independent nation-state in the era of post-socialism. Yerkira, Yerkirchi, the country is not a country. As I moved about the city myself, traveling from neighborhood to neighborhood, sometimes with these taxi drivers who resounded this negation, and sometimes on public transportation, I heard many other negating statements about Armenia's post-socialist time-space. There are no more Armenian people. There are no Armenian families here anymore. This country does not have a government. There is no dignity for the Armenian people. And this is not a place to live. These are ruins. What does it mean that now, when Armenians finally have the independence that 19th century nationalists advocated for, and through which they rallied up sentiment, rendering love for an abstracted cultural religious heritage into a politically legitimate love of fatherland, to borrow from Gerard Libaridian, that Armenia is in ruins? What does it mean that after the euphoric sense of national unity that made up the national independence movement of the late 1980s and early 1990s, Armenia ceased to be? What does it mean that Armenians survived centuries without political sovereignty, survived genocide, that now, in the time of post-socialism, Armenia has perversed from these paths of survival? To understand what many Armenians describe as ruins, we have to think about what kind of time-space preceded this historical era of post-socialism. Socialism was an alternative to liberal form of modernity, during which the state planned industrial, familial, cultural, and distribution development and insisted on growth outside of markets. This alternative modernity was not only premised on state planning, but a reimagining of the possibilities, often temporally stated, of everyday life. As Sheila Fitzpatrick has argued for the Soviet Stalinist era, everyday life was aesthetically and culturally based on a narrative that would eventually become the official form of art known as socialist realism. Seeing life as it was becoming rather than life as it was. An empty ditch was a canal in the making. A vacant lot where old houses or a church had been torn down, littered with rubbish and weeds, was a future park. The narrative of socialism was, thus, built on an evolutionary promise that society had transcended an old form, becoming something new. State socialism was built on an affirmation of future. In some ways, this narrative is what queer theorist Jose Munoz has called the not yet, or the present as a making of future with a creative recontextualizing of the possibilities of what is yet to come. Post-socialism, however, is on a different temporal and spatial path. Privatization schemes in the 1990s, also sometimes referred to as the shock therapy of austerity measures, left 2.5% of the population controlling over 60% of industry, and 55% of industrial infrastructure liquidated, sold for parts, for about $800,000 by 1997. Privatization led to the emergence of an oligarchy with strong ties to the new government. This new government has had little interest in future-making projects in the independent nation-state. Unemployment and underemployment have led to massive exodus, with 40% of the population emigrating from the country in the early years and thousands continuing to leave every year since. Post-socialist Armenia, for many of its inhabitants, seems like an empty time-space of ruins, not in the present, but in a presentless melancholia of the past, leading to no future. But these times of no future are also times of a politics of negating refusals. The era of post-socialism in Armenia, like much of the neoliberal world, has given rise to many massive social movements with no as a uniting message. No to hikes in transportation costs. No to hikes in electricity costs. No to the oligarchy and its impunity. No to monopolies. No to privatization. If the future is to come, in other words, Armenia's presentlessness must be negated to make room for a present. These politics of no performatively translate the negation of Armenia's presentlessness into an affirmation of a future. On December 6, 2015, Armenia held a constitutional referendum that changed the government from a presidential system to a parliamentary system, ensuring that the current Republican Party would be able to stay in power after President Serge Sargsyan's final term is up. Many activists on that day, whether they went to vote or not, were convinced that the vote would be an automatic yes, made by the state's and oligarchy's machinery of falsification. Through a campaign of no, these activists decided to put the Republican Party and their corruption that had produced a presentlessness in the country for over a decade to rest. As election polls were closing and the counting had begun, after a day of intense monitoring of the various frauds and inconsistencies in voting regulation at many of Armenia's polling stations, Zaruhi Postanjian, a member of the National Assembly with the opposition Heritage Party, made a video that spread quickly through social media.
Ես լինելով Հայաստանի Հանրապետության քաղաքացի, նաև ապրելով Արաբկիր համայնքում, պետք է այսօր, եթե իրոք օրինական կարգով ենք մենք առաջնորդվում, պետք է գնայի ընտրատեղամաս եւ եթե իրապես ընտրություններ են, ապա պետք է նաև մասնակցեի ընտրություններին։ Բայց հաշվի առնելով, որ այս իրավիճակում, երբ ապօրինի գործառույթներ են տեղի ունենում Հայաստանի Հանրապետությունում, երբ կեղծ գործընթացների ներքո իբրև թե անցկացնում են ընտրություններ, ես նախընտրեցի իմ պարտքս հանուն Հայաստանի Հանրապետության կատարել այս ձևով, այսինքն այրել Սերժ Սարգսյանի, Գագիկ Հարությունյանի եւ Տիգրան Մուկուչյանի խրտվիլակները, որոնց վրա դուք տեսաք ինչ էր մատնանշված, վերջին բոլշևիկի, վերջին չեկիստի եւ ՀՀԿ-ի վերջի գործիքի անվանումն էին նրանք կրում եւ որոշեցի, որ պետք է այսպիսի այրման միջոցով խրտվիլակների, իրենց խրտվիլակների այրման միջոցով կատարեմ իմ պարտքը հանուն Հայաստանի Հանրապետության.
With this act, Postanjian was not only refusing to participate in the machinery of falsification, but was putting that whole system to rest, burning bridges to this already past, and simultaneously producing a new imaginary of an Armenia. In these reimaginings of a present and future within a politics of refusal, the Nietzschean notions of negation and affirmation meet at the moment in which presentlessness demands one in order to produce the other. For Nietzsche, affirmation is a kind of future-making endeavor that requires affirming all past as well as the present. But Armenia, out of time, presentless, cannot affirm, cannot move toward affirmation in future without simultaneously negating presentlessness. The concept of translation here is helpful. Walter Benjamin pointed out that translation has, always, a vital connection to its original by the very fact of its translatability. But this connection might, in the final instance, not have any import for the original. The translation of negation into affirmation produces something that is not reactive will to power, but an affirmation of a present to future. The act of saying no through multiple social movements in Armenia since 2012 negates as an act of affirming the present that may allow future to follow, but only through making use of, indeed translating on the spot, reactive will into affirmation of what is to come.